I worked 5 jobs, day and night, just to pay off my wife's debts. Until one night, exhausted, I came home, stood at the door, and overheard her say something about me that shattered everything I believed. What she said changed my life forever.
I never imagined that my life would become a relentless cycle of exhaustion, all in the name of saving someone I loved from a past that refused to stay buried. Every single day began before the sun rose, when the world was still quiet and forgiving, and my body already felt like it had lived 3 days instead of one. 5 jobs. Not as a challenge, not as ambition, as survival. I worked nights, mornings, afternoons, and whatever hours were left in between. My hands were always tired, my eyes constantly burning, and my mind trapped in a fog that never fully cleared. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that sacrifice was what love demanded. I repeated those lies so often they started to sound like truth. All of this was to pay off my wife's debts, debts that existed long before me, but somehow became my responsibility. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I carried enough weight, we would reach peace. I thought endurance made me strong. I didn't realize that while I was breaking myself quietly, something was happening behind my back that would completely redefine my understanding of love, loyalty, and respect. There were signs, of course, subtle absences, conversations that ended too quickly when I entered the room, a distance in her eyes that no amount of money or effort seemed to close. But I was too tired to question, too committed to doubt. Trust, I believed, meant silence. It meant swallowing discomfort and choosing faith over fear. So I kept going. I kept working. I kept bleeding hours and energy into a future I thought we were building together. The truth revealed itself slowly, then all at once, like a crack in glass that suddenly shatters under the smallest pressure. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that while I was sacrificing everything, I was doing it alone. Love, I learned, is not measured by how much pain one person can endure for another. Loyalty is not proven through self-destruction, and respect cannot survive where honesty never existed. In the end, the exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. I had given so much of myself that I forgot to ask whether I was being given anything in return. And in that awakening, painful as it was, I understood something I should have known all along. Saving someone else should never require losing yourself. The debts weren't small mistakes or minor financial setbacks. They were overwhelming, layered, and suffocating. Credit cards pushed beyond their limits, loans taken in moments of panic, and choices made under the false comfort of denial instead of responsibility. When she finally told me, her voice trembled, and tears traced silent paths down her face, as if shame itself had grown too heavy to hold inside. I didn't interrogate her. I didn't demand explanations or timelines. I looked at her and said the words every man believes define commitment. We'll handle this together. That sentence changed my life. From that moment on, I became a machine designed to endure. I took every extra shift offered, filled every empty hour with labor, and learned how to function on exhaustion alone. I said yes when my body screamed no. Friends stopped calling because I was never available. Family gatherings faded into distant memories I barely recognized anymore. Sleep became something I borrowed in fragments, stolen between alarms and obligations. My reflection grew older faster than time should allow, but I ignored it. Whenever she asked if I was okay, I smiled and said I was fine. I perfected that lie. I believed love meant suffering quietly, that real men carried burdens without complaint, without weakness, without rest. I believed strength was measured by how much pain you could hide. So I swallowed everything, fatigue, frustration, doubt, and kept moving forward. What I didn't see was how much of myself I was leaving behind. Piece by piece, I disappeared. My dreams, my joy, my sense of self all faded into the background, replaced by responsibility and obligation. I became a solution, not a person. A provider, not a partner. And I wouldn't fully understand the cost of that sacrifice until the moment I realized that while I had given everything to save us, I had never stopped to ask whether anyone was trying to save me. The moment that shattered my illusions didn't arrive with yelling or confrontation. It came quietly, almost cruelly ordinary. I came home earlier than usual one night, my body trembling with exhaustion, my mind barely stitched together by habit and willpower. As I stepped inside, I heard her voice drifting from the bedroom. She was on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen, but when my name slipped into the conversation, my entire body froze. I stood there, half hidden by the hallway wall, holding my breath as if even the sound of my lungs might expose me. At first, she laughed softly, a familiar laugh. Then her tone shifted, sharpened by something cold and careless. She began talking about me, not as her husband, not as her partner, but as if I were an object, a resource, a solution. "He's killing himself working," she said, amused. "But it's useful. He thinks this is love." That sentence struck harder than any physical blow ever could. In that instant, every sleepless night, every aching muscle, every sacrificed dream came crashing into my chest all at once. The weight I had been carrying for months suddenly made sense, not as love, but as leverage, not as partnership, but as convenience. I felt something break inside me, something quiet and final. The fog I had lived in lifted just enough to reveal the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't being appreciated. I was being exploited. My exhaustion wasn't accidental. It was expected. My silence wasn't respected. It was convenient. And the most painful realization of all wasn't what she had said. It was what I understood in that moment. I had mistaken self-destruction for devotion. I had called it loyalty. I had defended it as love. But standing there in the dark hallway, listening to my worth be reduced to usefulness, I understood the truth with brutal clarity. I had allowed it. I leaned against the wall as her voice continued, my legs weak, my chest tight, as if the air itself had grown heavier. There was no gratitude in her words, no trace of concern, no awareness of the damage being done. She spoke about my exhaustion as if it were a minor inconvenience I had chosen, something expected, something guaranteed. My suffering wasn't tragic to her, it was routine. That was the moment something inside me cracked open. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to let the truth seep in. I finally understood that sacrifice without respect isn't love. It's self-destruction. I had confused endurance with devotion, silence with strength. I had been slowly erasing myself and calling it commitment. I didn't storm into the room. I didn't demand explanations or unleash the pain boiling inside my chest. Instead, I turned around and walked out. The night air hit my face as I sat alone in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring into the darkness ahead. The engine was off, the world was quiet, and for the first time in years, so was the noise in my head. That's when I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided at all costs. Why was I destroying myself for someone who saw my suffering as normal? The question echoed louder than her voice, louder than every excuse I had ever made for her, louder than the lies I told myself to keep going. That night, I didn't lose my marriage. Not yet. What I lost was far more defining. I lost the version of myself that believed love required silence, pain, and disappearance. And in the stillness of that moment, I understood that whatever came next would hurt, but it would no longer be built on my erasure. The days that followed were heavy, but they were also awakening. I kept working, but my mind was no longer numb, no longer anesthetized by routine and exhaustion. Awareness crept in where survival once lived. I began to notice everything I had ignored for so long. My health deteriorating quietly, my peace constantly postponed, my identity reduced to usefulness. I wasn't tired simply because I worked too much. I was tired because I was living for someone else's comfort instead of my own dignity. That realization hurt more than the exhaustion ever had, but it also brought clarity. Pain can blur, but truth sharpens. I started pulling back carefully, deliberately, reclaiming pieces of myself I had buried under obligation and guilt. I reduced my hours. I allowed myself to rest without apologizing for it. I stopped explaining my limits as if they were flaws. For the first time in years, I treated my own well-being as something that mattered. I also stopped measuring my worth by how much pain I could endure. I let go of the belief that suffering was proof of love, that destruction was devotion. Strength, I realized, isn't about how much you can carry. It's about knowing when to put the weight down. And then the most powerful truth settled in. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Need consumes. Love sees. Love respects. Once that understanding took root, there was no going back to who I had been. The blindness was gone. My life was no longer about fixing someone else's mistakes or paying for choices I never made. It became about choosing myself, about reclaiming my voice, my time, my dignity, before there was nothing left of me to choose. As the days passed, something inside me shifted permanently. I was still working hard, still honoring my responsibilities, but the blind obedience that had guided my life for so long was gone. I no longer moved on autopilot. I began questioning beliefs I had carried my entire life without ever challenging them, ideas so deeply ingrained they had felt like truths rather than choices. When had I learned that being a good man meant suffering in silence? When did I decide that love had to cost me my health, my peace, and my identity? Those questions followed me through long shifts and quiet nights, refusing to be ignored. I realized I had confused loyalty with self-neglect and commitment with martyrdom. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. Every time guilt surfaced, especially when I rested, I didn't push it away. I sat with it. I let it speak. And in that discomfort, I uncovered a truth that changed everything. I wasn't afraid of work. I was afraid of becoming unnecessary. I had built my entire sense of worth around being useful, reliable, unbreakable. If I could carry everything, then I mattered. If I stopped, I feared I would disappear. But usefulness is a dangerous foundation for love. It turns affection into transaction and presence into performance. The moment you stop providing, you stop mattering. That realization shook me to my core, exposing how fragile my self-worth had been all along. For the first time, I wasn't just tired, I was awake. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't leave quietly. It lingers. It demands change. It refuses to let you return to the version of yourself that survived by disappearing. One night, after finishing yet another long shift, I sat alone in my car with the engine off, wrapped in a silence so deep it felt intentional. The exhaustion that settled into me was different now. It wasn't just physical, it was existential, heavy with questions I had avoided for years. I stared through the windshield and asked myself something that genuinely terrified me. If I stopped doing all of this, who would I be? That question cracked something open. It exposed how thoroughly I had erased myself over time. I no longer knew my own limits. I couldn't name my own desires. My life had narrowed into a single function: responsibility, fixing, saving, holding everything together so no one else had to feel discomfort. I existed in reaction, not intention. And in that still moment, a painful clarity arrived. No one had forced me into this role. I had stepped into it willingly because it felt safer to be needed than to risk being rejected for who I truly was. Being indispensable protected me from abandonment, or so I believed. I hid behind usefulness because it felt like armor. That realization didn't weaken me. It stripped me of illusions. It made me honest. And honesty, I learned, is where real change begins. Not with anger or blame, but with responsibility for the choices we make to survive. Sitting there alone, surrounded by darkness and quiet, I made myself a promise. Simple, but powerful. I would no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable. Whatever came next might be uncertain, even painful, but it would no longer be built on my disappearance. When I finally confronted her, my voice didn't shake. There was no anger to unleash, no accusations waiting to explode, no dramatic outbursts demanding an audience. There was only truth, calm, steady, and unavoidable. I told her what I had heard. I told her how it made me feel. I explained how close I was to burning out completely, how exhausted I had become not just in my body, but in my spirit. I told her how invisible I felt inside my own marriage. At first, she tried to soften it, to minimize the damage. She called it a misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context. But jokes don't expose truth, they reveal it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or scramble to prove my pain was valid. I didn't need to. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was being clear. I told her I would no longer work 5 jobs to clean up decisions I didn't make. I told her I was done sacrificing my health, my peace, and my identity in the name of love that demanded my disappearance. I stated my boundaries plainly, without apology. I watched her expression change as the reality settled in. Confusion gave way to discomfort to fear. Because something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer negotiating my worth. I wasn't asking to be seen or appreciated. I was demanding respect. That moment marked a turning point, not because she changed instantly, but because I did. I had stepped out of survival mode and into self-respect. And once that line is drawn, there is no returning to who you were before. That conversation didn't magically fix our relationship. If anything, it made everything more uncomfortable. But I learned quickly that discomfort is a small price to pay for self-respect. For so long, I had mistaken peace for the absence of conflict, even when that peace came at my expense. Now, I was choosing honesty instead. I began cutting back my workload. I prioritized sleep, my health, and something I had almost forgotten how to value: clarity. The world didn't collapse the way I had always feared it would. Bills were still there. The debts didn't vanish overnight, but they stopped being my entire identity. They became a problem to manage, not a definition of who I was. During that phase, I learned something critical. When you stop overcompensating, people are forced to confront their own responsibilities, and not everyone reacts well to that shift. Some resist it, some resent it, some try to pull you back into the role you played so well for so long. But those reactions are revealing. They tell you who benefited from your exhaustion and who actually cares about your well-being. I wasn't becoming selfish. I was becoming balanced. And balance felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable at times, because it didn't rely on self-erasure. But it also felt right. For the first time in years, my mind was clear. My breathing was deep and unhurried, and I could finally imagine a future that didn't revolve around constant sacrifice, but around sustainability, dignity, and choice. As my energy slowly returned, so did parts of me I thought were gone forever. I reconnected with friends I had quietly pushed aside, picking up conversations as if time hadn't stolen years from us. I laughed without glancing at the clock, without calculating what it would cost me later. I rested without guilt, without the familiar voice telling me I had to earn my right to stop. And in those quiet, ordinary moments, I rediscovered something profoundly powerful: peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the steady kind that lives in alignment. I realized how long I had existed in survival mode, mistaking stress for purpose and exhaustion for strength. I had confused being constantly needed with being valuable. But real strength isn't measured by how much you endure. It's measured by how well you protect what matters most: your health, your dignity, your sense of self. Strength is knowing when to stand firm instead of bending, when to rest instead of pushing, when to choose yourself without shame. I no longer saw myself as a savior or a solution to someone else's problems. I saw myself as a man worthy of mutual effort, honesty, and respect. Someone who deserved partnership, not dependency. And that shift didn't just change my relationship. It rewired how I lived, how I loved, and how I valued myself. In reclaiming my peace, I didn't lose anything essential. I found myself. With each passing week, I began to see how deeply survival mode had rewired my thinking. I had normalized stress to the point where peace felt suspicious, as if calmness itself were a trap. Rest made me uneasy, like I was slipping into something forbidden. Silence felt unearned, a luxury I hadn't allowed myself to claim in years. I realized how dangerous that mindset was, because when suffering becomes familiar, you stop questioning it. You begin to believe that exhaustion is proof of virtue, that depletion is a sign of love, that pushing past your limits is admirable. But in reality, I was slowly training myself to accept less care, less respect, less reciprocity. I was shrinking my expectations of life and of people around me, convincing myself that what I gave was all that mattered. As I started paying attention, I noticed how often I had ignored my own emotions just to keep things running smoothly. I swallowed disappointment. I buried frustration. I replaced my needs with obligations as if survival depended on it. Writing became my lifeline. Late at night, in the quiet moments when the world had finally stopped demanding from me, I would sit alone and put words to the feelings I had avoided for years. And through those words, I met a version of myself I barely recognized. A man who was loyal, hardworking, and deeply committed, yet completely disconnected from his own worth. That realization didn't break me. It grounded me. It reminded me that awareness is the first step toward reclaiming yourself, and that acknowledging your own value is not arrogance, it is survival. And in that grounding, I began to understand that living fully meant more than enduring. It meant being present for myself, not just for everyone else. The shift in our relationship forced both of us into uncomfortable honesty. With me no longer absorbing every consequence, reality surfaced quickly, unfiltered and unavoidable. Bills still existed. Pressure still existed. Life didn't pause because I had stopped overextending myself. But now, responsibility had to be shared. I stopped rescuing. I stopped smoothing over problems that weren't mine to fix. And in doing so, I saw clearly how much I had been enabling, often without realizing it. She struggled with that change. So did I. Letting go of the savior role felt like stepping off a cliff, unsure if the ground would appear beneath me. But it did, slowly, unevenly, but enough to hold me steady. I learned something essential. Helping someone doesn't mean shielding them from accountability. True support empowers growth, it doesn't replace it. For the first time, our conversations weren't just about survival. They were about solutions, about shared responsibility, about truth instead of illusion. Even when those conversations were tense, even when they stung, they were real. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was present. I was honest. I was grounded in my boundaries, and that alone shifted the entire dynamic between us. What once felt like constant exhaustion and imbalance began to feel like partnership, built on clarity, respect, and the kind of presence I hadn't allowed myself in years. As clarity returned, my focus began to expand beyond the immediate crisis. I started thinking long-term, not just about money, bills, or survival, but about life itself, about purpose, about the kind of man I wanted to be when the noise finally settled. I realized how often I had postponed my own happiness, telling myself it would come later. After the debts, after the struggle, after the sacrifice. But later is a dangerous illusion. Life doesn't pause while you endure it. It moves forward, relentlessly, whether you're present or not. That understanding hit me hard. I didn't want to wake up one day and realize my best years had been spent exhausted, unseen, and emotionally bankrupt. I wanted balance. I wanted fulfillment. I wanted a kind of love that nourished me rather than eroded me. That awareness reshaped my goals. I stopped chasing temporary relief and started building sustainability, habits, routines, and boundaries that preserved my energy, my peace, and my dignity. I began to invest in things that mattered long-term: my health, my relationships, my growth. That shift, subtle at first, changed everything. Suddenly, life wasn't just a series of fires to put out. It was a landscape I could navigate with intention, purpose, and a sense of self I thought I had lost. People around me began to notice the difference before I fully did. They said I looked calmer, more grounded, more alive. What they couldn't see, though, was the weight I had finally set down, the invisible burdens I had carried for years. I was no longer hauling unspoken resentment, unrealistic expectations, or the pressure to save someone else at the cost of my own well-being. I learned something essential. Boundaries don't push people away. They reveal who respects you. And respect, once you experience it, becomes non-negotiable. I no longer apologized for resting. I no longer justified my limits. I simply lived within them, unapologetically and intentionally. And the more I did, the more my confidence grew. Not from control over others, but from trust in myself. I trusted my instincts. I trusted my judgment. I trusted myself to walk away from what harmed me and to protect the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. That trust became my new foundation. It wasn't flashy, dramatic, or loud, but but it was steady, unwavering, and powerful. And from that foundation, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I was whole. I was enough. And for the first time, I was truly free. Looking back now, I understand that overhearing that conversation wasn't a betrayal. It was a revelation. It forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding, the reality I had dressed up in excuses and silence. It gave me a chance to change course before it was too late, to reclaim parts of myself I had long forgotten. Pain has a way of sharpening your vision if you allow it, stripping away illusions until only what truly matters remains. I no longer regret the sacrifices I made, because they taught me resilience and self-awareness. They showed me what I was capable of enduring, and more importantly, what I was capable of refusing. But I also learned a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. Love should never require you to disappear. Commitment should not cost you your identity, and loyalty should never demand your silence. That realization didn't come easily. It came in pieces, through exhaustion, reflection, and quiet nights alone. But it came with clarity. And clarity, once earned, becomes a form of freedom no one can take from you. It is the freedom to choose yourself, to honor your limits, and to live fully without apology. That freedom, I have learned, is the most profound act of love you can offer. Not to someone else, but to yourself. After everything I had been through, I stopped seeing pain as something to be endured, as if suffering alone proved my worth. I began to see it as information, messages my body, mind, and heart had been sending for years, messages I had refused to decode. Every moment of exhaustion, every wave of resentment, every quiet ache in my body was trying to tell me something I had ignored because listening would have demanded change. And change had always felt dangerous. But now I understood something vital. Continuing the same way was far more dangerous than confronting the truth. Strength is not measured by how much you can carry, but by how well you recognize when to set something down. I stopped glorifying struggle. I stopped treating constant sacrifice as a badge of honor. I began honoring sustainability instead, learning to protect my energy, my peace, and my dignity. I stopped confusing love with obligation, realizing that devotion does not require self-erasure. And in that shift, I found something I hadn't felt in a long, long time: alignment. My actions finally reflected my values. My choices were no longer dictated by fear, guilt, or the need to prove myself. That alone restored a sense of peace I had long thought lost, a quiet certainty that I could live fully, with boundaries, respect, and authenticity guiding the way. The future no longer felt like a distant reward I had to suffer endlessly to reach. It felt tangible, something I was allowed to shape, step by step, with intention and care. I began adjusting my life not just to recover, but to grow, slowly, deliberately, with purpose. I reduced my workload to something my body could actually sustain, something that left space for rest, reflection, and presence. I started investing in opportunities that aligned with who I was becoming, not who I had been forced to be. The more I honored myself, the more my confidence stabilized. Not in a loud, performative way, but quietly, steadily, unshakably. I finally understood a truth I had long ignored. Worth is not proven through exhaustion. You don't earn respect by destroying yourself. Respect begins the moment you decide that your well-being matters, that your voice, your time, and your energy have inherent value. That understanding didn't just change my schedule, it reshaped my identity. It taught me that being whole, grounded, and intentional is far more powerful than being busy, drained, or endlessly compliant. I realized that my life could be lived fully, with dignity and purpose, without sacrificing the very self that makes it worth living. Whether my marriage would fully heal or not became secondary to something far more important: my honesty with myself. I stopped pleading to be understood and began expecting mutual effort. I stopped over-explaining my boundaries and started enforcing them. And that shift revealed everything I needed to know. Some people grow when you grow, others resist, because your evolution disrupts the balance they once benefited from. Neither reaction is your responsibility. I learned that relationships don't break because of boundaries, they break because of imbalance. And when you correct that imbalance, the truth surfaces quickly, clearly, and without excuses. That clarity didn't make me bitter. It made me free. Free from guilt. Free from self-betrayal. Free from the relentless need to prove my value through suffering. I discovered that true freedom isn't about control over others. It's about sovereignty over yourself. And in claiming that freedom, I finally understood what it means to live with integrity, dignity, and presence, fully, unapologetically, and without compromise. Today, when I look at my life, I see it through a different lens. I no longer measure success by how much pain I endured or how many sacrifices I made in silence. I measure it by how intentionally I live, by the clarity with which I align my actions and values. I still believe in commitment, effort, and responsibility, but not at the cost of my own existence. I believe in partnerships where support flows both ways, where struggles are shared, and where respect is unwavering. I've learned that love, loyalty, and dedication are meaningful only when they coexist with boundaries, honesty, and self-respect. My story isn't about blame or resentment. It's about awakening. It's about the moment you realize that saving everyone else at your own expense isn't noble, it's unsustainable. The bravest thing I ever did wasn't working 5 jobs, collapsing in silence, or enduring beyond my limits. The bravest thing I ever did was choosing to stop abandoning myself. And that decision changed everything. It didn't just reshape my life. It redefined who I am, how I love, and how I show up in the world. For the first time, I am fully present, fully grounded, and fully myself. If you hear yourself in this story, let this be your reminder. You are not required to destroy yourself to be worthy of love. Hard work is honorable, but self-respect is essential. Your value is not measured by how much you endure, how much you sacrifice, or how quietly you suffer. Don't wait until your body collapses or your spirit fractures to give yourself permission to rest, to speak, to draw a line. Life sends wake-up calls in many forms, sometimes gentle, sometimes brutal, sometimes in words you were never meant to hear. When that moment comes, listen. Not with anger, not with denial, but with courage. Because the most powerful transformation doesn't occur when others change. It occurs when you finally choose yourself, when you reclaim your energy, your boundaries, and your dignity. That choice is not selfish. It is necessary. And once it is made, it has the power to redefine your entire life, reshaping how you love, how you live, and how you honor the person you were meant to be.